EIF, we're trying to describe what has happened over a period of time and why we have more people self-employed in the industry. A severe recession, workers became more reliant on themselves and went down the route of seeking jobs here on a self-employed basis here, there. And now we have an industry that's based on a system. I mean, come on, be honest. This idea of using the flexible definition of what a worker is, what an employee is going on for much, much longer. It's probably going on right back to the 80s. The idea that workers no longer have a sort of set of rights that are entrenched around their life and their expectations. And but even if I accept what you say about the recession and the reason why construction workers had to kind of redefine themselves because they had to work for themselves more, find odd jobs here, there and yon. Why now, when the building industry is booming, when you see skyscrapers all over the skyline of Dublin, or not skyscrapers, cranes all over the skyline of Dublin, why now is the phenomena of self-employment at the rate it is when you have building companies who are making massive profits, and some of them, we've heard about them recently in very controversial circumstances around the Children's Hospital, etc. Some of them who are notorious for engaging people on self-employment. And I believe it is because they will not get a job unless they declare themselves to be contracted, self-employed contractors. And that's the only way they'll get the job. And it's the same for people who work in this house, and whether it has happened by default or not, it has happened. And the problem is that it seems to be like, well, there's nothing to see, move on. When actually, when it does happen, most of the workers to whom it happens, that they can only get a job in the field that they work at if they declare themselves to be, or define themselves to be independent contractors rather than workers, are going to suffer less pay, worse conditions, more insecurity. Checking it out and going to the WRC or to the scoping exercise might even mean that they lose their job because they're no longer of use to the contractor who's contracted them. So I think we just need to take it serious and stop saying there's nothing to see. It's a real issue.
Thank you, Deputy Smith.
The first thing I'd like to start by saying is that there's something that you both finish on in your presentations that I agree with, and that is the scale of the challenge that we are facing, that we don't have enough data on it. And when we had department officials in here before on this issue, it was clear from them that they hadn't done enough research or haven't had access to employment areas sufficiently to be able to tell us how great the problem is. So we believe we have a deep problem here, and we're here representing our constituents. We believe it's widespread. We, and I'd say probably all of us here are members of trade unions, know from the data collected by trade unions that there is a deep problem and that it's growing. You guys are saying that you don't have enough evidence and you need to identify the scale and nature of the challenge. There aren't enough data available to support claims made in the construction industry, for example, about the levels of bogus self-employment. So we might start by agreeing that we need to look very deeply at this sector and at this problem to find out exactly what is going on. But that will require cooperation of employers, big contractors on building sites, big contractors in industry, and even, I would argue, the cooperation of the state itself. Because sometimes by default, the state itself uses what we determine as bogus self-employment to fulfil a role. Now, I don't think that a lot of the time it's deliberate or they set out to do it, but there is such a level of increase in contracting out and subcontracting that a lot of malpractice goes under the radar. And it's that radar that we need to get under and examine exactly what is going on. And as the Deputy said, or the Senator said, I don't know who said it before me, we're not making this stuff up. We don't have these bills before the House because we've nothing else to do, or that we're just amused by it. There is a real problem here. And I'd just like to use a little bit of evidence that comes from the ICTU. Just bear with me a second because I have a lot of notes in front of me. Okay. There's a briefing note we got from the ICTU. The report notes that in 2017, the Joint Investigations Unit of Revenue initiated a campaign specifically focused on the construction sector, and as a result of this activity, €60.2 million was recovered by revenue, and nearly 500 subcontractors were classified as employees as a consequence. That's an important fact, and that is a fact that I don't think you're going to deny or disagree with. It's facts coming from revenue, so that in 2017, one investigation produced €60 million recovered that was owed to the state, and yet you're telling us these are anecdotal and there's nothing to see here, move on. Somehow we're imagining that there's not really a problem. So I think if we can acknowledge there is a problem, but we haven't investigated it properly, but when it's investigated it yields results, and this investigation by revenue is a serious investigation. You also talk about the fact that there's no problem because self-employment levels are falling. But here's an interesting quote from a study done, and I think you should have a look at it because it's involved in your industry. The Connect Union have done a really seriously good study into bogus self-employment. And what they point out that the CSO labour force shows the numbers of employees and self-employed across a range of employment sectors, the numbers of people who are self-employed without they themselves having employees is actually rising very, very seriously, which indicates that if you take on a contractor, they're free then to take on other people to do work, either occasionally or permanently or from time to time. The numbers that are taking on other people to work are dropping. The numbers that don't take on anyone, in other words, that they just work for themselves, are rising very, very dramatically. And I think that that would give you an idea of this type of increase that we believe is out there. For example, in the second quarter of 2018, the percentage of people classified as self-employment with no employees in construction was 24.3%, while in transportation and storage it was 14.8%, and that compares to 3.9% for industry as a whole. So there is a problem. If you're taking on construction workers who themselves are not taking on others, they then become the type of worker that is defined as having their own contract. So I'm going to ask you both to come back and define for us what you believe is bogus self-employment. And I would just like to describe first what we would, I think in general, accept as the term of somebody who is self-employed. It is somebody who has control over what's done, how it's done, when and where it's done, or whether he or she does it personally or hires other people to do it on their terms, or to do the work that has been agreed by themselves. Labour lawyers call this the independent test. So it shouldn't be it should be simple enough for us to tell the real thing. But a worker with only the tools of the trade, who doesn't hire or manage other workers, who works where and when and how they are told by a boss, should always be counted as an employee. Workers like this can be engaged as subcontractors, but then they're treated as self-employed for the purpose of workers' rights when it comes to tax, PRSI, insurance, pensions, etc. Let me put it to you this way. If you tell me your definition of what you believe is bogus self-employment, I'd like to hear it, because let's think about the workers in this room. There's people who work for the civil servants, there's people who work the cameras behind the glass there. You would imagine that when they show up for work, they're told by their employer what they do, that their pay is determined by their employer, as is their hours and conditions, that they don't provide their own equipment, that they don't hire other workers because they're employees. They don't make a profit of how much they do, regardless of how efficient they are. And by most people's common sense, they're employees. They turn up and they're told what to do. The workers behind the glass there who fill in this are not. They're defined as self-employed. And I would like to ask you, in your opinion, is that how you view bogus self-employment? Because they are not entitled to the protections that employment law gives to other workers. Gives it to us, because we pay PRSI and we're paying into a pension, etc. Their contracts are deemed as self-employed because they must sign up to saying that I am a contractor working for a company that the state hires out to do this job, and they have no choice in it. But yet they have no control over their own daily work and how they do it. Now, could you come back and I mean this, I'm saying that because this is an arm of a function that is done by the state for the state, and yet it happens to be what I would define as bogus self-employment. I'm going to ask you both to come back and tell us how you define bogus self-employment.
Thank you, Deputy. Deputy Collins.
Yeah, I think that's probably the most important question in relation to how the definition of employee is critical here, or how these common law tests that we have are applied. They are necessarily nuanced. They have necessarily developed over time to capture the variety of arrangements that are out there, and very much sought after and wanted by the individual self-employed people to which they apply. That is why we would have a concern about how any legislation would develop. And when I hear Senator Nash referring to the Competition Amendment Act 2017, I'm even more concerned, because he suggests that that really consolidated the existing revenue code into a definition, a statutory definition. It really didn't. It summarised in a very, very brief form what the code says, and would likely capture a great many people out there who wouldn't consider themselves by any means to be falsely self-employed or an employee. The other issue it raises is the question of dependent contractor, because that is in the same section of definitions. And in that particular section, it states that a dependent contractor is somebody who has 2 clients or fewer and works for another person, whether or not that person is an employer of other people. Now, that raises a very scary prospect for individuals who might be out there seeking a piece of work to be done, only to find that the person that they believe is an independent contractor coming up to do this very short piece of work has no other clients but them. And all of a sudden, what rights do they have? Right now, under the Competition Amendment Act, they have very limited contained rights for competition law purposes. But if we're going to look to sections like that for definitions in any new legislation, that is a very worrying prospect for a lot of self-employed people as well as for business generally.
Thank you.
Chairperson, before you move on to the Construction Industry Federation, could we come back to what IBEC have just said, just briefly? Is that all right?
If it's brief, because I do want to...
Yeah, it's just on this question of definition. I find what Ms Murphy said extremely interesting, because you started by saying that that definition has to be flexible. The definition of employee has to be flexible to allow it to morph and change as circumstances change. And that goes to the heart of the problem. IBEC want it every way. You want to be able to change the definition of an employee to suit an employer, and then say, no, it's to suit the self-employed. That just is the most illogical set of constructive ambiguity I have heard in a long time. But you're doing it in order to cover up what really isn't about the individual window cleaner. It's about the widespread practice of forcing workers to define themselves as independent contractors so that their working conditions, pay, etc. can be exploited, and leaves them very insecure. It also robs the state of social protection money and tax and all of the other things. And I think that you need to listen back to what you've just said, because these workers who provide us with the recordings provide us with a very valuable piece of evidence that what you have just said there is to make out that definitions can be flexible, must be flexible in order to allow for the flexibility of the labour market to suit IBEC.
Thank you, Deputy Smith. I'll let you respond and then I'll come.